Chapter 11. Scandinavian Influence in England. Of the districts occupied by Scandinavian settlers in England, the ones which show their presence most strongly are Cumberland, Westmorland, North Lancashire and Yorkshire in the old kingdom of Northumbria, and the district of the Five Boroughs in the Midlands. East Anglia was not so deeply affected by the Danish occupation. Before dealing with one of the chief sources of our knowledge of the presence of Norse and Danish settlers in various parts of England, viz. The evidence derived from place nomenclature, a few words must be said as to the chief Scandinavian elements which can be recognised in English place names. Of elements other than personal names, the commonest are as follows, several of them being used as independent words to this day in English dialects, which have been affected by Scandinavian influence. Beck, Old Norse bekkr, brook, small stream of water. Byggen, (g end of bracket), Old Norse bygging, building. By, Old Norse bor, Danish, Swedish by, town or village. This word indicates a Danish rather than a Norse settlement. Kar, kur, Old Norse kjar, kjur, brushwood especially on swampy ground. Dale, Old Norse dalr, valley. Etymologically this word might be of native English origin, but its distribution points to Norse influence. Fell, Old Norse fjalla, mountains. Force, Old Norse fors, waterfall. Forth, Old Norse fjorður, fjord. English ford and Scandinavian forth often interchange in the old documents. Garth, Old Norse garðr, enclosure, the Scandinavian equivalent of English yard. Gill, Old Norse gill, deep narrow glen with the stream at the bottom. Holm, Old Norse holmr, small island especially in a bay, creek or river. In England its meaning was further developed and it often means low-lying level ground on the borders of a river or stream, now often concealed in the suffix ham. Keld, Old Norse kelda, well, spring. Lund, lound, Old Norse lundr, grove, now often corrupted to land in English place names. Mire, Old Norse myr, moor, bog, swamp. Raise, Old Norse hreisi, cairn. Scale, Old Norse skatli, house. This word is Norse rather than Danish. Skar, skir, skeri, Old Norse sker, isolated rock in the sea. Scout, Old Norse skuti, cave formed by jutting rocks. Skaug, skow, Old Norse skogar, wood. Slak, Old Norse slaki, slope on a mountain edge, often used in English place names of a hollow or boggy place. Tarn, Old Norse tjorn, small lake. Thorp, Old Norse thorp, hamlet, village. This word is also found in Old English and in some place names is undoubtedly of native origin, but its general distribution points fairly conclusively to Norse influence. Thwaite, Old Norse thveit, parcel of land, paddock. Toft, Old Norse topt, piece of ground, messuage, homestead. With, Old Norse vithur, a wood. Wath, Old Norse voth, a ford. Place names with the prefix Norman mark the settlement not of Normans but of Norsemen (or Northmen as the English called them), as in Normanton and Normanby, while the settlement of Danes is marked by the prefix denna or den, as in Denaby and Denby. This latter prefix, however, has other sources as well. Scandinavian personal names are very common in place names, but their presence can as a rule only be detected with any degree of certainty by reference to the forms found in early documents. Among the more easily recognised are Grímr as Grímsarg (Lanks), and Grimsby (Links), Gunnar as in Gunnarside (Yorks), Ketil as in Kettlewell (Yorks), Clacker as in Claxton (North), Ormr as in Ormskirk (Lanks). Others to be found by reference to earlier forms are Frani as in Frainsfeld = Fransfield, Notts, Gammal as in Gamelstun = Gamston, Notts, Gunulfr as in Gunulveston = Gonalston, Notts, Knútur as in Knutestone = Knutston, Northants, Leifr as in Levisby = Laceby, Links, Sumarlithi as in Sumarlidebi = Somerby, Links, Skúli as in Skúlatuna = Skáldton, North, Tóli as in Torlisland = Tosland, Hunts, Vikingur as in Wichingestone = Wigston, Lace, Ulver as in Ulvesby = Ulseby, Links. Examining the distribution of Scandinavian place names determined by the above tests and others which can be applied with great accuracy if we study not the modern but the old forms of the place names, we find that the place nomenclature of Cumberland and Westmorland is almost entirely either Scandinavian or Celtic. Indeed, it would seem that the Anglian settlement had hardly affected these districts at all, and it was reserved for the Scandinavian settlers to Teutonise them. The same is true of Furness and Lancashire, north of the Ribble, whose old names Sturkaland and Agmunderness are of Norse origin, but south of that river there is a great diminution of Norse place names, except along the coast and a little way inland, where we have several bys and dales. In Cheshire the evidence of Scandinavian settlement is confined almost entirely to the Wirral, but there the large number of bys and place names like Thingwall point to a strong Viking colony, and the distribution of place names in South Lancashire and Cheshire bears witness to active intercourse between the settlers in Ireland and England. On the other side of the Pennine chain, though Northumberland was several times ravaged by the Norsemen and was probably well populated at least in the fertile river valleys, there is practically no evidence of their presence to be found in place names. There are several Biggins, Carrs and Holmes, a few Tofts and Dales, but these are common dialect words and usually found in uncompounded forms. They are practically never found in names of towns or villages, and may well have been introduced from districts further south. In the extreme west and southwest of the county there are fells and dales, but these are on the borders of Cumberland, Westmorland and Durham. The small streams are burns and not becks, the Wansbeck being a corruption of an earlier Wanesbeik. When we cross into County Durham, the tributaries of the Wear vary between burn and beck, but by the time we reach the Tees these have all become becks. Beechburn Beck, a tributary of the Wear, shows how a Scandinavian term could be attached to an English name when its own meaning was neglected or forgotten. Other Scandinavian names are common, but as in Northumberland they belong to the dialect generally and are seldom found in names of towns or villages. Viking settlers must have been few in number and widely scattered throughout these two counties. One great exception must be named among the towns, viz. Durham itself. The city was named Dunholmr, the hill island, by the Vikings, and its present name is only the Norman corruption of that form. South of the Tees we find ourselves in a district whose place names are to a very large extent Scandinavian, and Norse settlements are thickly and evenly distributed from the North Sea to the Pennine chain. Passing from Northumbria to the Danelagh, Lincolnshire is perhaps more purely Scandinavian in its place names than any other English county. In Derbyshire, Viking influence is not so strong, but the county was probably very thinly inhabited, at least in the north and west, and did not offer attractive settling ground. Derby itself was rechristened by the Northmen, its earlier name being Northwearthig. The rich fields and pastures of Leicestershire attracted a great many settlers, and Nottinghamshire is also strongly Scandinavian. Rutland and Northamptonshire are strongly Danish, except that there is some shading off towards the southwest corner of the latter county. In the country bordering the Danelagh on the south and west, Staffordshire has a few Scandinavian place names on its Derbyshire and Leicestershire borders, while Warwickshire has several on its Leicestershire and Northamptonshire borders. In East Anglia, Danish settlements must have been numerous in the north and east, especially towards the coast, but their presence is less strongly marked in the southwest portion of the county. In Suffolk they are confined still more definitely to the coast districts, and the Danes do not seem to have settled in the south of the county at all. 3 Kirbies near the Essex coast mark settlements in that county. Of the other border counties, Huntingdonshire, Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire show only the slightest traces of Scandinavian influence in their place nomenclature, though we know from other evidence that there must have been many Danish settlers in these counties. Closely allied to the evidence of place names is that of dialect. A very large number of words definitely of Scandinavian origin are found in the dialects of North East and North West England, in the North Midlands and East Anglia, but they do not furnish so sensitive a test as do place names for the extent of the Scandinavian settlements, and they need not be discussed here. More interesting as evidence of the deep influence of the Viking settlers on our language is the large number of Scandinavian loan words which have become part of our standard speech, many of them being words essential to our everyday talk. To Scandinavian influence we owe the pronouns they, them and their, the adjectives same and both, the fro in to and fro, and possibly the auxiliary are and the preposition till. These last are found in the Northumbrian dialect of Old English, but their widespread use is probably due to Scandinavian influence. In addition to these we may note the following: verbs bait, bask, batten, call, cast, dawn, droop, drown, gain, gabble, ransack, scare, scour, scrape, skim, skip, squeal, stint, take. Nouns: anger, billow, boon, dusk, fellow, gate, grime, haven, husband, husk, husting, skull, scurf, skill, skin, skirt, sky, window. Adjectives: awkward, ill, odd, rotten, scant, sly, ugly, weak, and a good many words in which Scandinavian forms have replaced the cognate English ones, e.g. aloft, athwart, awe, birth, egg, get, gift, give, guest, raid, sister, swain, Thursday. These words are for the most part of the very stuff and substance of our language, giving vivid expression to clear-cut ideas, and though numerically they are outnumbered by the loan words from French, they are in themselves more essential to our speech than the rich vocabulary derived from that language. For the extent and character of the Viking settlements in England, we have however a far more delicate and accurate index than that to be found in the evidence of place names and dialects. When we study the pages of Domesday, the great record of English social organisation in the 11th century, we find that in the counties which came under Viking influence there are many details of land division, tenure, assessment, and social organisation generally, wherein these counties differ from the rest of England, and some of these differences can still be traced. The ridings of Yorkshire and the Lindsey division of Lincolnshire were originally Thrythings (Old Norse Þrithjungur, a third part), the initial th being later absorbed by the final consonant of the preceding east, west, north and south (in links). The chief tests of Scandinavian influence drawn from Domesday and allied sources are however as follows. 1. The use of the Danish wapentake as the chief division of the county in contrast to the English hundred. This is found in Lincolnshire, Derbyshire (with one exception on its southern border), Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, Rutland, and one district of Northamptonshire, now included in Rutland. We have wapentakes in Yorkshire, except in certain districts along the sea coast, while in Lancashire the term was applied to the court of the hundred or shire long after the conquest. There is some evidence also for the belief that the use of the hundred (or wapentake) as an administrative unit is in itself due to Scandinavian influence. The proportion of names of hundreds (or wapentakes) which are definitely of Danish origin is very high, and, unless we assume wholesale renaming, this points to their having been first named at a period subsequent to the Danish conquest. 2. The assessment by carucates in multiples and submultiples of 12 is characteristic of the Danelagh as opposed to that by hides arranged on a decimal system in the strictly English districts. This is found in Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire and Rutland. With the exception of the above mentioned district, there are traces of a duodecimal assessment in the 2 north-east hundreds of Northamptonshire, while in Lancashire a hydal assessment has been superimposed upon an original carucal one. Carucal assessment is found also in Yorkshire, Norfolk and Suffolk. 3. In Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and Yorkshire we have traces of the use of the Danish long hundred (= 120), e.g. the fine for breaking the king's peace is £8, i.e. 120 ores of 16 pence. Using the various tests we find that the Scandinavian kingdom of Northumbria was considerably smaller than the earlier realm of that name, Northumberland and Durham being but sparsely settled, while South Lancashire and Cheshire were occupied chiefly along the coast. The kingdom would seem to fall into two isolated halves, Cumberland and Westmorland and North Lancashire in the northwest and Yorkshire in the southeast. The district of the 5 boroughs covered Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire (Lincoln and Stamford), Leicestershire and probably the whole of Rutland (Stamford). The case of Northamptonshire is difficult. The carucal assessment fails except in the extreme northeast of the county, but Danish place nomenclature is strongly evident, though it shades off somewhat towards the southwest. It resembles Danish East Anglia rather than the district of the 5 boroughs, and it is possible that the boundary of Guthrum's East Anglian kingdom, which is only carried as far as Stony Stratford in the Peace of Alfred and Guthrum, really ran along Watling Street for a few miles, giving 2/3 of that county to the East Anglian realm. Northumbria was governed by a succession of kings. The 5 boroughs formed a loose confederation, and there can be no question that the districts which obeyed the boroughs of Derby, Leicester, Nottingham, Lincoln and Stamford and Northampton form the modern counties named from these towns. It is also to Danish influence, direct or indirect, that we owe the similar organisation of the counties of Huntingdonshire, Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire in the old East Anglian kingdom. Each of these counties had a jarl or earl, whose headquarters were at the borough. He summoned the here, whether for political or military purposes, and when these counties passed once more under English rule, he fulfilled the functions of the older ealdorman. In East Anglia, apart from place names and carucal assessment in Norfolk and Suffolk, we are left with the boundaries of Guthrum's kingdom and with various miscellaneous evidence for estimating the extent of Scandinavian influence. There is a curious Hundredus Dacorum in Hertfordshire, whilst the Historia Eliensis and other documents tend to show the presence of a strong Danish element in the population and social organisation of the districts around Cambridge. The kingship of East Anglia came to an end early in the 10th century, and it is probable that its organisation was then changed to one resembling that of the 5 boroughs, viz. A number of districts grouped around central boroughs, which afterwards became counties, except in the older division of Norfolk and Suffolk. A careful study of Domesday and other authorities reveals many other features of interest in our social system which were due to Viking influence. Certain types of manorial structure are specially common in the Danelog. Manor and vill are by no means identical, indeed several manors are included under one vill. Very frequent is the type which consists in a central manor with sokeland appurtenant. In the Danelog there was a large number of small freeholders, and the free peasant class was much more numerous in the Anglo-Saxon England. These districts stand in clear contrast to the strongly manorialised southern counties, and they were not feudalised to any appreciable extent before the Norman conquest. When that system was imposed, we often find single knights' fees having to be taken over by entire communities of sokemen. The holds of Northumbria, who rank next after the earls, and the drengs of Cumberland, Westmorland, Lancashire, Northumberland and Durham are also of Scandinavian origin. The dreng was a free servant of the king endowed with lands, and the name still survives in the Yorkshire place name Dringhouses. The legal instinct was strong in the Scandinavian mind, and English law bears deep marks of its influence. The very word law itself is of Scandinavian origin and has replaced the English doom. The chief judicial authority in Lincoln, Stamford, Cambridge, Chester and York was in the hands of 12 lagmen or judices. These lawmen, though they had judicial authority, were not chosen by the king or by popular election. Their position was hereditary. Of special interest are the 12 senior thanes of Aethelred's laws for the 5 boroughs enacted at Wantage in 997. They have to come forward in the court of every wapentake and to swear that they will not accuse wrongly any innocent man or conceal any guilty one. The exact force of this enactment has been a matter of dispute, whether the thanes simply bore witness to the personal status of the accused, thus enabling the court to determine the ordeal through which he should be put, or whether we have an anticipation of the system of presentment by jury. Whatever may be the exact truth, there can be little doubt, says Dr. Vinogradov, that such a custom prepared the way for the indictment jury of the 12th century. The same author attributes to Danish influence a new conception of crime. It is no longer merely a breach of the peace or the result of a feud, to be settled by monetary compensation. It is a breach of that conception of honour which binds together military societies. The criminal is now branded as nithing, a man unworthy of comradeship with his fellow warriors. Unfortunately, it is only within the last few years that the question of Danish influence on our social, political and legal systems has been treated at all seriously, and much work still remains to be done. but we can already see that the Danes affected English life far more deeply than a superficial glance might suggest. Doubtless the Danish invasion struck a heavy blow at learning and literature, a blow from the effects of which not even the heroic activities of an Alfred could save them. But there can be no question that in the development of town life, in the promotion of trade, in the improvement of organisation and administration, in the modification of legal procedure, the invaders conferred great benefits on the country as a whole. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. Scandinavian influence in the Empire and Iceland. Considering the long and devastating campaign of the Vikings within the Frankish Empire, and more especially within its western portion, it is surprising that they only formed permanent settlements in one small area, leaving practically no marks of their presence elsewhere. Great portions of the Low Countries were in almost continuous occupation by them during the 9th century, but the opportunity was lost, and beyond an important share in the development of the trade of Duurstede, the Vikings hardly left a sign of their influence behind them. The case of Normandy is different. Here we have a definite district assigned to the invaders, just as the Danelagh was given to them in England, and the whole of that territory is deeply impregnated with their influence. Many of the Norman towns in Vil contain as the first element in their name a Norse personal name, e.g. Cataville, Calverville, Colville, Folkville, Haqueville, containing the names Kate, Calfer, Kohler, Folki, Hakon, while the suffixes Beck, Buff, Dale, A, Gard, Lond, Torp, Tot, Tweet, Vic, as in Bolbeck, Elbuff, Sausedal, Jersey, Epigard, Mandalond, Torgestorp, Abbatote, Braquetweet, Barvik, go back to Old Norse Becker, Booth, bracket, Booth, end of bracket, Dollar, A, bracket, Island, end of bracket, Garther, Lunder, Thorpe, Topt, Thwaite, Veek. The dialect of Normandy to this day contains a good number of Scandinavian words, and others have been introduced into the standard language. Some of these have also found their way into English through our Norman conquerors, e.g. abet, baggage, elope, equip, jolly, rubbish, scoop, strife, just as the Bulbeck in Swaffham Bulbeck, bracket Cams, end of bracket, and Bulbeck Common above Blanchland in Northumberland is from the great Norman barony of Bulbeck, so named after Bolbec in Normandy, of which they once formed part. Norman law and customs also show many traces of Scandinavian influence, and so does Norman folklore. The Normans still looked to Denmark as their homeland down to the end of the 10th century, and at least twice during the reign of Harold Bluetooth their dukes received help from that country. The nobles soon ceased to speak their old northern language, but it is probable that it remained current on the lips of the people for some considerable time longer. The Vikings always showed themselves keenly sensitive to the influence of a civilization higher or more developed than their own, and this is nowhere more apparent than in Normandy. Heathenism found a champion as late as 943 when, on the death of William Longsword, a rising of heathen Normans was crushed with the aid of the Frankish king, but for the most part the Normans soon showed themselves devout sons of the Church and were destined in the 11th century to be numbered among the most ardent supporters of the Crusades. With the adoption of Christianity they learned to respect and honour those homes of learning which they had once devastated for their wealth of hoarded treasure, and the famous school at Bec, whence came Lanfranc and Anselm, was only one among many which they richly endowed and supported. Their religious and artistic feeling found expression in that development of Romanesque architecture which we know as Norman, and which has given so many famous buildings not only to Normandy but to England, to Sicily, and to southern Italy generally. In literature the Norman French trouvères did much towards popularising the romances of war and adventure which play so important a part in medieval literature, and when they settled in England it was largely due to Anglo-Norman poets that the matter of Britain became one of the great subjects of romance for all time. In its social organisation Normandy seems speedily to have been feudalised. Rollo divided the land among a comparatively small number of large landholders, and the system of land tenure was quite different from that in the English Danelagh with its large number of small freeholders. On the other hand, it was probably due to Norse traditions of personal freedom that serfdom disappeared earlier in Normandy than in any other of the French provinces. Trade and commerce were fostered here as everywhere by the Vikings. It was the Normans who first taught the French to become a power at sea. Many French naval terms are of Norman origin, and from the Norman province have come some of France's greatest sea captains. The Vikings, like the Franks before them, threw off their old speech and submitted to the all-embracing power of Latin civilization, and the result was a race endowed with vigorous personality, untiring activity, and the instinct for ruling men. The Normans may have become largely French, but they lost none of their old enterprise and spirit of adventure. In the 11th century they conquered England and founded great kingdoms for themselves in Sicily and South Italy. No Viking stock was more vigorous than that which resulted from the grafting of Gallo-Latin culture on the ruder civilization of the Teutonic North. Their influence on France as a whole is not nearly as great as the influence of their kinsmen in England, probably because English government was centralised (under Norman rule) much sooner than French government, and their influence was thus able to make itself felt outside the actual districts in which they settled. The settlement of Normandy helped however towards the consolidation of power in the hands of Charles the Bald and his successors, much as the settlement of the Danelagh helped in establishing the final supremacy of Wessex. It remains to speak of the one great home of Viking civilization to which more than one reference has been made in previous chapters, viz. Iceland. The story of its settlement is a very simple one. It commenced about 870 when many great Norwegian noblemen sought there for themselves and their followers a freer life than they could obtain under the growing power of Harold Fairhair. It was greatly strengthened by settlers both from Norway and from Ireland and the Western Islands, when that power was firmly established by the Battle of Hafrsfjord, and by the year 930 the settlement was practically complete. Iceland was more purely Scandinavian than any other settlement made during the Viking Age. Here we have not the case of one civilization grafted onto another and earlier one, as in England, Ireland, or the Frankish Empire, but the transference of the best and finest elements in a nation to new and virgin soil where, for good or ill, they were free to develop their civilization on almost entirely independent lines. Settlers from the Western Islands and from Ireland may have brought Celtic elements, and Christianity was not without influence when it was introduced from Norway at the close of the 10th century. But on the whole we see in Iceland just what Viking civilization was capable of when left to itself. At first the settlers lived in almost complete isolation, political and religious, from one another, but they soon found that some form of organisation was necessary, and groups of settlers began by choosing from amongst their number a gothi or chieftain, half priest, half leader, who was the speaker at their moot and their representative in negotiation with neighbouring groups. Then continued disputes, and the lack of a common law led to the establishment of a central moot or althing, with the speaker to speak one single law for all. But the Norsemen were much better at making constitutions and enacting laws than they were at observing them when instituted, and the condition of Iceland has been vividly if roughly summarised as one of all law and no government. The local things or the national althing might enact perfect laws, but there was no compelling force, except public opinion, to make them be obeyed. Even the introduction of Christianity made no difference. the Icelanders quarrelled as bitterly over questions of ecclesiastical as of civil law, and the authorities of the medieval church were scandalised by their anarchic love of freedom. In the words of Professor Kerr, the settlers made a commonwealth of their own, which was in contradiction to all the prejudices of the Middle Ages and of all ancient and modern political philosophy, a commonwealth which was not a state, which had no government, no sovereignty. It was anarchy without a police constable. The result was that the rich men grew richer, the poor became poorer, the smaller gentry died out, and the large estates fell into fewer and fewer hands. The great men quarrelled among themselves, intrigued against one another, and played into the hands of the Norwegian kings, who were only waiting their opportunity. It came in the days of Hákon the Old. Lands and thanes were sworn into subjection to that king at the Althing in 1262, and in 1271 the old Icelandic common law was superseded by a new Norse code. The failure of the Icelandic commonwealth is amply compensated for by the rich intellectual development of Icelandic literature, which owed many of its most characteristic features to the fact that it was written in a land almost completely isolated and detached from the main currents of Western medieval thought and the general trend of European history. But in itself that failure is full of deepest import for a right understanding of the part played by Viking civilization in Europe. Powerful and highly developed as that civilization was in many ways, it only reached its highest and best expression when brought into fruitful contact with other and older civilizations. There it found the corrective for certain inherent weaknesses, more especially for certain tendencies of too strongly individualistic character leading to political and intellectual anarchy, while at the same time by its own energy and vigour it quickened the life of the older civilizations where they were tending to become effete or outworn. The Germanic peoples had done much for the development of European civilization in the time of the wanderings of the nations, but by the end of the 8th century they had lost much of their pristine vigour through contact with the richer and more luxurious civilization of the Roman world. It was reserved for the North Germanic peoples, or the Northmen as we can more fitly describe them, in the 9th and 10th centuries, to give a yet more powerful stimulus to European life, if not to European thought, a stimulus which perhaps found its highest expression in the great creations of the Norman race in the world of politics, the world of commerce, the world of architecture, and the world of letters. End of chapter 12. End of the Vikings by Ellen MAWER.